Outside right now, the temperature is dropping to 4 degrees below zero. Maybe colder, and you're not worried about it, not even a little, because somewhere behind a wall in your house, the furnace already clicked on the second the room dipped below 68 degrees. It'll keep clicking on all night, completely automatic, without you lifting a finger. Now, rewind about 20,000 years. Same brutal cold, sometimes worse. No furnace. Half the time, not even a wall. Just skin. And a temperature low enough to stop a human heart in under 3 hours if you got any single part of the plan wrong. And somehow every one of your ancestors got it right. Not once. Every winter for over 300,000 years in a row. Without one mistake big enough to end a whole generation. If they had, you wouldn't be here reading this. Here's the part that usually gets skipped. That streak wasn't luck. Luck doesn't survive 300,000 consecutive winters. What actually happened is that your ancestors stopped being victims of the cold and started being its engineers. They noticed what worked, cut what didn't, handed the working version down to the next generation to improve on. You're not descended from people who got fortunate. You're descended from people who kept testing until the design stopped failing. And right now, you're still living inside that design. You just can't see the blueprint anymore because someone hid it behind a drywall. So let's actually look at it. Start with how badly built humans were for this in the first place. It matters. Every other animal in the deepest cold snaps came pre-equipped. Mammoths carried a coat of fur over a layer of fat thick enough to shrug off a blizzard. Cave bears solved winter by sleeping through the whole thing, letting their bodies idle until spring. Reindeer solved it by simply walking somewhere warmer. Humans had none of that. Strip a person naked and drop them into real cold, and you're not looking at a bad afternoon. You're looking at hours before the body starts failing for good. On paper, humans were the worst equipped animal for the Ice Age, dropped straight into one of the harshest climate stretches this planet has produced in a very long time. What they had instead was a brain built for planning ahead, and a pair of hands built for testing ideas. Stack that combination generation after generation, and it quietly out-engineered fur, fat, and hibernation combined. It started with fire, because nothing that follows works without it. At a site called Qesem Cave, in what's now Israel, archaeologists have found some of the clearest evidence anywhere of fire being built and rebuilt on purpose in the exact same spot over and over as early as roughly 300,000 years ago. That's not someone got lucky with a lightning strike. That's a fire pit somebody kept coming back to, using it, maintaining it, teaching other people how to rebuild it. That kind of repeated, deliberate behavior is what separates a fluke from a technology. By the time the worst of the Ice Age hit, that technology had been refined hard. Hearths at cold climate sites show real engineering choices. Stone linings, careful fuel management, built to burn hot and controlled, not just flicker. When wood ran out on open treeless land, people didn't just sit there shivering. They switched fuel entirely, rendering animal fat and burning bone instead. Because a fire that's keeping you alive doesn't get permission to go out over a shortage of sticks. And no, there was no app quietly managing the temperature overnight. Somebody had to physically wake up in the freezing dark, feed it, and go back to sleep. Basically the Ice Age version of setting 6 alarms so you don't sleep through a flight. Except getting it wrong here didn't just cost you a missed connection, fire also bought back something that had nothing to do with warmth at all. Time. On a night that could stretch past 16 hours of total darkness, firelight meant extra hours to talk, to teach, to pass down exactly how last winter's mistakes got fixed, instead of just sitting in silence, waiting for the sun. But fire has one obvious design flaw. You can't take it with you. Step outside its light, and the cold is right back, waiting. So the next problem was carrying fire's job around on your own body. The seed of the idea probably came from watching the animals themselves. The creatures that shrugged off that same cold weren't smarter. They were just wrapped in something that trapped their own heat against their skin. And here's the part worth sitting with. That trapped heat didn't disappear the moment the animal died. Somebody noticed that. Noticed that if a dead animal's coat still worked, maybe theirs could too. That noticing is the entire invention. Right there, before a single stitch was ever sewn. At first, that meant skins thrown loosely over the shoulders, and this trick is old. In Northern Europe, archaeologists have found cut marks on ancient bear paw bones in exactly the spot you'd slice to pull a pelt off cleanly, dated to at least 300,000 years ago. But a draped hide leaks heat out of every gap along the edge. And leaky doesn't survive 40 below. So the design kept getting refined, tested, adjusted, tested again, until it stopped leaking. The fix, when it finally shows up in the record, is almost comically small. A needle, thin enough to thread, with a tiny hand-drilled eye. In 2024, researchers excavating the La Prairie mammoth site in Wyoming, a team from the University of Wyoming, publishing their findings in the journal PLOS I, recovered more than 30 needle fragments carved from the bones of red foxes, hares, and felids, possibly lynx, mountain lions, or the extinct American cheetah-like cat, dated to roughly 13,000 years old. Tools that small, made from that many different animals, aren't a one-off. They're evidence of a whole toolkit, refined specifically for turning loose fur into clothing that could actually seal against the wind. A blanket thrown over your shoulders and a coat stitched to fit your exact body are two different machines. One leaks, the other doesn't. And that gap between wearing a hide and engineering a garment may be part of why our species was able to expand into some of the coldest environments on Earth. That's not a lucky guess passed down unchanged. That's someone noticing a problem, testing a fix, watching it fail a little less each time, and teaching the next generation to start from the better version instead of from scratch. Strip away the fire. Strip away the fur. Strip away every tool. What's left, notice, test, refine, repeat, is the actual fingerprint of intelligence. It's the same loop an engineer runs today, just measured in centuries instead of software updates. They didn't stop at needle and thread. Before heading out into open snow, hunters rubbed rendered animal fat over their faces and necks, sealing the skin against the wind. And out on bright reflective snowfields, there was a danger almost nobody thinks about now: snow blindness. Glare strong enough to actually damage your eyes. Much later, Arctic hunters carved narrow slits into bone or wood and tied them across their faces like goggles, cutting the glare down to a manageable sliver, an early form of sunglasses. Built by people who had never seen a mirror, let alone a lens. Solving an eye problem most of us only think about after a bad batch of ski trip photos. Everyone pictures Ice Age humans huddled at the back of some dripping cave. That picture undersells what they actually pulled off. On the open plains of what's now Ukraine, there weren't many caves, and almost no wood at all, so people built with the only heavy material lying around everywhere: mammoth bones. At a site called Mezhyrich, archaeologists have uncovered round structures built almost entirely from mammoth skulls, tusks, and leg bones. Skulls and heavy limb bones stacked as a foundation, ribs and curved tusks forming the frame above. Hundreds of individual bones in a single structure. A 2025 study led by Wei Chu at Leiden University, using updated radiocarbon dating, pinned one of these structures to roughly 18,000 years ago, and found the chronology was consistent with a single occupation, although repeated visits across as much as 4 centuries could not be ruled out. Somewhere out there, a group of people built substantial architecture. Meanwhile, insurance companies today won't let you put up a garden shed without 3 separate inspections. The engineering inside goes further than walls made of bone. Some later cold climate shelters used what's now called a cold trap doorway, with the entrance dug lower than the sleeping area. Cold air is heavy. It sinks and pools at the low entrance, while warm air rises and stays where people actually slept. That's a genuine principle of physics, applied correctly long before anyone had a formal explanation for it. Nobody accidentally digs a doorway lower than their bed. Somebody tried it, felt the difference, and kept doing it. The exact same design logic your HVAC technician runs through today, just without the whiteboard. They also piled thick walls of snow around shelters on purpose, because snow is an excellent insulator, capable of keeping the inside near freezing even while the air outside drops far below it. Understanding the principle behind a proper igloo long before anyone had perfected one. Even the small stuff was engineered. Building inside stands of trees, where a cluster of trunks blocks a huge amount of wind. Packing gaps with moss, mud, and pine resin, sealing a shelter tight enough to actually hold a fire's heat. Staying warm buys you tonight. Winter's slower, quieter killer is hunger. For months at a stretch, there was almost nothing left to gather and very little to hunt. So surviving winter meant treating a good kill less like a meal and more like a resource to bank. The cold did half the work, freezing fresh meat solid within hours. What didn't freeze got smoked over fire, or dried into something close to jerky. People dug storage pits into frozen ground and used natural cold cellars, letting the earth hold food at a stable temperature for months. Researchers at the University of Michigan, studying an 11,000-year-old mastodon kill site in southern Michigan, found direct evidence that Ice Age hunters weighted meat down and sank it into cold ponds on purpose. An early refrigerator that needed no power source and couldn't fail during a storm. Lab experiments recreating the method found the meat stayed genuinely fresh as long as the pond stayed frozen over, and was still nutritionally useful months later, even after it started to smell. Almost nothing from a kill went to waste. A strange thing to sit with in a world where most of us throw out food that's barely a day past its date. None of this worked without actually catching enough animals in the first place. One of the clearest examples sits at the foot of a limestone cliff in eastern France, near the town of Solutré. For decades, there was a dramatic legend attached to the site. Hunters supposedly stampeded entire herds of wild horses off the rock to their deaths below. It makes a great story. It's also wrong. What the evidence actually shows is quieter and smarter. Horses migrated past that rock every year, moving between valleys with the seasons the way they always had. Hunters simply positioned themselves at that predictable bottleneck and took advantage of the herds passing through, not once, over and over across tens of thousands of years. Hunting the exact same choke point for that long isn't a lucky ambush repeated by accident. That's a plan, tested once, remembered, and handed down through more generations than most modern institutions have even existed for. Here's something easy to miss in all of this. Your ancestors weren't caught off guard by winter the way we are when a storm knocks the power out for a weekend and nobody can figure out dinner. Their entire year was built around getting ready for the cold months, because they knew exactly what was coming, and they used each other as a heat source on purpose. Far more people lived under one roof than most of us would tolerate today, packed into far less space than we'd call comfortable. That closeness was the point. Body heat, multiplied across enough people in an enclosed space, is a real and meaningful source of warmth. The person with an entire shelter to themselves wasn't the lucky one, they were the exposed one. It was almost always people living alone, especially older adults without close family nearby, who died first when a hard freeze rolled in, simply because there was no one close enough to share warmth with through the worst of the night. If hitting like and subscribing sounds like a small, empty gesture, here's the honest version. It costs you nothing, and it's the easiest way to tell the algorithm that a story like this one deserves to land in front of more people. So if you're still here, go ahead and do it now, because what's coming next is the part most survival videos about this era skip entirely. Cooperation kept most people alive. It did not make everyone kind, and the record doesn't let us pretend otherwise. At sites tied to the late Ice Age Magdalenian culture, places like Qesem Cave in England and Mezhyrich Cave in Poland, researchers have found human bones bearing clear butchery marks. At Qesem Cave, skulls were modified into what look like drinking cups. In one case, a human arm bone was carefully engraved with a decorative pattern after death. Here's the detail that actually reframes the whole thing. Researchers studying Qesem Cave have pointed out this doesn't read like simple, desperate cannibalism at all. The bones show the same careful, deliberate treatment you'd expect from a funeral, not a famine. At Mezhyrich Cave, the bodies were also systematically processed, although researchers still cannot say exactly why. Whatever this was, for at least some of these communities, it looks less like a last resort and more like a ritual. A way of handling death that we, thousands of years and a very different worldview away, don't fully understand yet. Winter didn't just test what people could build. It tested what people were willing to become to keep living. Both of those things are true at once. Pretending otherwise does your ancestors no favors. The instinct to trade body heat for survival didn't disappear once the Ice Age ended. It just got weirder. In parts of medieval Europe and Russia, during the harshest winters, farming families brought their livestock indoors, cattle and sheep on the ground floor, the family living directly above them. The animals threw off real, usable body heat, and it rose straight up through the floor into the living space overhead. You were, quite literally, living in a tiny house with built-in floor heating, and the heating system had a face and ate hay, which honestly puts most modern, sustainable living trends to shame. Some populations took another route as well. Alongside engineering around the cold, their bodies may also have adapted to run through it. The Yagan people, living at the southern tip of South America in a cold, wet, and relentlessly windy environment, traditionally wore little to no clothing, even in brutal conditions. Recent genomic and bone density research on ancient Fuegians, published in scientific reports, found a rare variant of a gene involved in brown fat development, which researchers proposed may have contributed to their cold tolerance. Separately, a later metabolic model estimated that the winter lifestyles of the Yagan and Alakaluf may have required an average daily energy expenditure roughly 2.5 times basal metabolism, essentially burning calories at close to the upper limit of what a human body can sustain. They'd also drop into a deep squat to rest, tucking arms and legs in close to cut down exposed surface area. Their answer to the cold wasn't a heavy coat. It was an entire high-energy way of life, possibly helped by biology. And then there's the strangest idea in this whole story. The one almost nobody expects. At a cave site in northern Spain called Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, scientists have studied the remains of human ancestors roughly 430,000 years old, who lived through an era of brutal, unstable cold. The bones carry a strange, repeating pattern, damage that comes in seasonal cycles, growth that stalls and restarts. Signs consistent with too little sunlight for stretches at a time, especially visible in bones from teenagers whose growth should have been steady. Researchers Juan Luis Arzuaga and Antonis Bartziocas, publishing their analysis in the journal L'Anthropologie, proposed something that sounds almost too strange to be serious. That with too little fatty food to survive a truly brutal winter, some of these early humans may have retreated somewhere sheltered and let their bodies slow down into something resembling hibernation, waiting out the worst months in a kind of deep, energy-conserving sleep. It's far from settled. Plenty of paleoanthropologists argue the bone damage has other explanations, but the fact that serious scientists are still debating it instead of dismissing it outright says something about how far your ancestors may have been willing to push their own biology just to see spring again. It's also worth saying plainly, not everyone alive during the Ice Age was fighting 40 below winds. People were living across warmer stretches of Africa, the Mediterranean, and parts of Asia during this same period, in climates that never demanded a single mammoth-bone wall. The cold weather engineering in this story is remarkable specifically because it was optional. In a way, breathing isn't. A set of solutions built by people who could have simply stayed south and didn't, which is really the through line running under every fix in this story. A bone needle, a cold trap doorway, a sunken pot of meat, a body that might have learned to power itself down for the season. None of it holds up as luck. Every piece got tested, kept if it worked, thrown out if it didn't, handed to the next generation to improve on. The same design loop that runs under every real engineering discipline today, just stretched out over 300,000 years instead of 3 fiscal quarters. For hundreds of thousands of years, making it to spring was never guaranteed. It was a test your ancestors had to pass, one specific engineering problem at a time. And they never stopped drawing up new blueprints until the whole species had a way through. You're not reading this because they were fortunate. You're reading it because, generation after generation, they refused to just wait the cold out. They built their way through it instead. And everything that keeps you warm right now, the wall, the furnace, the coat by the door, is just their blueprint, still standing. Long after the people who drew it disappeared into the cold, they beat. Somewhere, tonight, your hand will find a thermostat in the dark without even looking. You won't think about it. That's the whole point. It was engineered that way. What's the coldest you've ever actually been, and how did you get through it? Tell me in the comments.